find her standing by the way.
Hello, welcome to the 6th episode of the MEON podcast. I haven't done one of these in a while, and I'm happy to be doing one after a long hiatus. This podcast will focus on a number of issues. I don't have a set agenda, so I have a vague idea of what I'll speak about. But beyond the focal issue at hand, which I'll probably link to in the title of the podcast, um, it really depends on what I'm feeling like, how long I want this to go on for, and so on and so on and so on. So I suppose the topic that I want to address is the recent split, I suppose, in the Irish left between László Molnárfi and whatever forces, elements, organizations, etc., if any, which László represents and which sort of concur with his tendency, um, versus, I suppose, people for profit, the established campus uni left, um, and other such forces which are hostile to linking the cause of labor, the cause of purportedly the cause of the working class, and so on and so on and so on, with the question of migration, specifically the question of profiteering um, off the backs of the asylum industry. The iPass controversy, which organizations such as Gript have covered extensively over the last number of years, and personages such as Nick Delahanty. Um, Laszlo recently also had a conversation on with Dean Catton from Breaking Point, and some of this touched on sort of Laszlo's rationale. So jumping on from this, I want to, I have a tendency to avoid, whether it's with the site, whether it's with pieces that I've written for the site, podcasts, etc. Everyday, mundane, news cycle, or topics which would fall within, say, the news cycle. The stuff that would be of interest to, South Dublin, sort of, or Middle Ireland, Irish Times reader. It's not really my ambit, it doesn't fall within my prerogative. What I am more concerned with is ideational tendencies, the interface between them and, say, historical contingency and other such matters. So intellectual history, in other words, to put it in less performatively, pretentious terms. Um, so yeah, Marxism. What is the relevance of Marxism today? Is Marxism a policy, right? I suppose this podcast will deal, now that it's becoming clearer and clearer to me, with the question of what Marxism is. And this is important and is pertinent in as much as it impacts and affects the coherency of any notion of a synthesis, or if not a synthesis, an alliance or a coalition between the forces of the Marxist left and the nationalist, you could say, right, for a better way to identify it, against the iPass industry and against, say, Zionism. How tenable is this? What is Marxism? Uh, who who would the sort of nationalist and migration skeptical right be getting in bed with, so to speak, if such a coalition was to happen? So I suppose it's important to go back to 1896. I believe it was 1896 when Friedrich Engels passed away. Engels, of course, is the sort of aide de camp of Karl Marx. Engels is a figure who's a theoretician in his own right, and whose socialism, utopian and scientific, has been proffered by more than one Marxist commentator as perhaps the best introduction to Marxism as a distinguished school of thought from earlier reactionary and utopian forms of socialism. Of the latter camp, some of the figures that Engels addresses include Robert Owen, I believe, from memory, Saint Simon, almost certainly Proudhon, probably not Bakunin, because Bakunin was more of a contemporary, and actually at the time of of that work being written. I don't know if Bakunin. No, Bakunin was around because he was involved in 1848 from memory. So I'm pretty sure it was 1896 when Engels died. Let me just double check that. No, he died in 1895. But Engels, after Marx's death earlier, was, I suppose, the last vestige of what could be said to be an authoritative figure within socialist discourse. Now, this is not to say, of course, that Engels was treated uncritically, nor was Marx. Marx's dispute with, say, Lassalle, his son-in-law, who's famous for the Lassalle-Bismarck alliance, or with the aforementioned Bakunin, and his earlier disputes with the young Hegelians, Bauer, Feuerbach, Stirner, etc. These are all notable in the intellectual history in the 19th century, and are often the impetus for his pamphlets and his essays and his books. And likewise with Engels, who fell into dispute, I believe, with I'm trying to think of who, like a few figures. I think Ludwig Waltmann, there was critical discourse between both of them there, or perhaps that was Lenin who condemned Ludwig Waltmann. Certainly, Lenin was a sparring partner of a figure who will play a prominent role later on in the 1890s and early 1900s in Marxism and social democracy, Edward Bernstein. Bernstein and Engels did not get along. Bernstein eventually, actually, who was the younger of the two men, became a disciple of Engels. But with Engels' death in 1896, Marxism had a problem. And this goes for any intellectual movement, whether one is looking at, sorry, let me just take a quick sip of my coffee. Whether one's looking at Christianity or Freudianism, in any tradition you have an eclectic body of work. So there's a natural impetus to say, hey, problem arises, right? Problem arises. Hey, let's consult the relevant literature. Let's consult, say, the Bible, But then the question is, which books in the Bible, different traditions, their exegesis is dependent upon which works they take seriously. I believe Luther famously removed some of the books in the Bible. I think there's a dispute between the Orthodox and the Catholics with respect to certain books in the Bible. And the same is true of Marx, as anyone familiar with 20th century Marxism will tell you, a large dispute, and one which mapped onto divisions with respect to the Eastern Bloc, the Hungarian uprising in 1956, was the question of whether the young or the old Marx was to be taken as the theoretical touchstone. The young Marx, of course, is more into alienation, not into alienation in the sense of, he enjoys it, but focuses, I suppose, on the psychological ramifications, the emotional, the cultural ramifications of capitalism, specifically upon the working class. He's a figure who is more humanistic, who is less, one could say, scientific, one could say empirical, less into to economics. So the Frankfurt School really jumped on the young Marx as a touchstone, whereas the old Marx, who would have, say, influenced the mature views of Friedrich Engels, who, if memory serves me right, coined the term dialectical materialism. I don't think Marx ever used the term, and certainly was the term adopted by people like Lenin and later Stalin and so on. For these Stalinist types, for people like, who'd come to mind? Althusser, Louis Althusser, the guy who strangled his wife. For people like them, the old Marx, the Marx of hard materialism, of who completely rejects normative, or at the very least devalues and displaces normative arguments for socialism in favor of looking at how the economic system in Germany, sorry, not in Germany, but in the Western world, will gestate, in the, at his time, the perspective, decades and century to come, and from that deduces modes of action and so on. That's the old Marx, and the crisis of Marxism really, and I know I'm being a bit roundabout here, but the crisis of Marxism really owes to the decline in, not the decline, but the failure of these predictions that Marx had to come through. So what are some of these predictions? And again, I'm not an expert on Marxism, but I have some cursory familiarity with it. Perhaps a bit more than that, perhaps a bit less. One of them is the falling rate of profit. You know, the Marxist view is that capital will not, you know, be able to the capital as capital becomes more intensive, right? As the inputs for a business to operate, a factory to operate, become more intense. There's more stress upon the capitalists themselves, and this would result from a variety of things. One is that to remain competitive in an industrial economy, you need more and more inputs. Supposedly, you need continuous improvements in this respect, and therefore the margin, the surplus margin that one as a capitalist can appropriate will become less and less and less. And given profit is the motive, and this is again, I'm giving I suppose a one could say straw man, others could say a simplified picture of this. But as there's a falling rate of profit, what will end up happening is that is that the capitalist will be disincentivized from engaging in or maximally using the productive forces. What's the consequence of this? Well, the consequence of this is that you now have a contradiction where once you didn't, between the profit motive, that catalyzer in the capitalist economy, and the productive forces themselves. And at this point, capitalism goes from being a progressive to a reactionary force in world history. There's a couple of ways in which, and people like Marx and his acolytes theorized about this. There's a couple of ways, and then this becomes crucial to the anti-fascist narrative in the 20th century, the early 20th century, the traditional anti-fascist narrative, which far predates concerns with respect to fascism's purported fidelity to the politics of hate, to jettisoning large sections of the population, so on and so on and so on. This far predates that, because immigration wasn't really a concern primarily back then, and the only politics which had any flavor of ethnicity entailed within it, if I'm speaking here about domestic politics, was any politics which related to, say, the Jews, and the question of the position of the Jews in a post what's the term? The term for the period in which the Jews were liberated from their traditional bonds in the feudal and early modern structures. What's the term? It'll come back to me anyway. But passing this period, passing this juncture, there becomes a question of, see, I don't want to get sidelined into the question of the Jews, so and their relevance to ethnic politics. But suffice to say, anyway, traditional anti-fascist narrative stressed that in this period of a falling rate of profit, what would end up happening is that the workers would receive less wages. They would consequently, or conditions would become more unfavorable. They may have to work more to compete in a world of, say, shrinking markets for for the factory, and the consequences of that, is as well as concomitant things like immiseration, the bifurcation of the classes, which would supplant a multiplicity of classes which once existed, including petite bourgeois ones, people who worked in handicrafts, guildsmen and craftsmen, and so on, so on, so on. That all this would lead to polarity in the domestic sphere, and I suppose internationally as well, between proletarian and capitalists. And so what would end up happening is that the capitalists would have to use movements, which would be reactionary in that. Well, I'll get onto that in a second, but would have to use movements like, say, what developed in the Italian peninsula in the late 1910s and early 1920s, the form of Italian fascism, to crush the workers' revolt. And so these movements like fascism were totally reactionary. As I said, or did I say earlier, I have a terrible tendency to go off the mark and go on tangents. So let me sort of go back to the question of Engels' death. So he dies in 1896, and following 1896, in 19 ooh, when did it come out? Was it 1889? No, 1898 or 1899, or was it 1901, 1902, or in around that time? Let me check. Edward Bernstein releases a pretty seminal book And that book, well, there's a few of them. The one that I've read part of is The Preconditions of Socialism and the Tasks of Social Democracy, which came out in 1899. Um, there's an earlier one, The Problem of Socialism. And there's even earlier ones than that. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia's bibliography here. Ferdinand Lassalle, social reformer. I don't know the angle he takes on Lassalle there. And then there's one on the English Revolution and communistic movements in the 17th century. I presume he's referring to the diggers and the levelers there. So, but you notice around the time of Engels' probably waning health, near his death, after his death, a flurry of these publications. And so you have the opportune time now. I'm not accusing him of being a total opportunist, although he's a social democrat, of mutating Marxism away from, say, the position of the late Marx or of Engels' interpretation of Marx, which was then, I suppose, orthodox or hegemonic. And the point, anyway, that Bernstein is getting at is that Marxism has declared itself, whatever its virtues, to be an empirical, a scientific movement, right? And if it's a scientific movement, then surely it should be verifiable. So those central claims, some of which I rambled about earlier on, the falling rate of profit, the bifurcation of the classes, so on and so on and so on, and then later on, and this is way after, of course, this is 15 years after, say, the release, 15 years after the release of the Preconditions of Socialism in 1899. In 1914, you have the First World War, and contrary to contemporaneous communist claims, the working class sided with their nation. Worse yet, the reigning social democratic parties, among whom we can include, the SPD in Germany. You have obviously the split in 1914-15 in 1915 among a group of Italian socialists who sign a manifesto. Oh, it's the fasci of something. This is not the fascist party yet, but it's what will end up being the fascist party. And actually, one of the original signatories, Mussolini was not one of them. Interestingly enough, you have people like Alceste de Ambris. You have that's the only name I can think of off the top of my head, and you have other figures who become these standard bearers of socialism in or sorry, standard bearers of well, you have these other figures who might go on later to do other things, such as being involved in the case of Alceste de Ambris in the formation of the constitution, sorry, of the Regency of Carnaro, and so yeah, these are some of the characters who are around then, and interestingly, if you look at that manifesto that they put out, and this is the origins of fascism, they identify their enemy not as the Jews, not as the communists, because they themselves were communists, the people who signed the declaration, but no, it was the reactionary forces of German militarism and the feudal structure of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that must be smashed, and in the effort and toward this progressive development, the overcoming of these forces, a democratic Europe would emerge, which would be more conducive to socialism. And so this connection again between Italian nationalism and socialism, which you see also with Mazzini, who is I don't know if he's a sparring partner of Marx, or at the very least his work was subject to critique by Marx. You see this kind of re-emerging again. And same obviously in Germany, and some of the people who were involved in Germany, I think they were called the War Hawks. That would be the English translation of the denomination for them. Some of these guys later came to be fellow travelers of the conservative revolutionary movement. In Belgium, you had guys like Henri de Man, if anyone's familiar with Paul de Man, the French, I think he's a French post-structuralist, and the scandal Walloon, post-structuralist, who moved to America, and the scandals involving him and a paper he wrote for when he was young. Well, Henri de Man is his uncle, who's a collaborator later on with the Nazis, and I believe around the time of the First World War was part of the pro-war faction. I could be wrong about that aspect of the pro-war dimension, but anyway, so you had a number of these socialists around Europe, all of whom, and even in Britain as well, you had elements on the socialist left that supported the war effort against Germany right now. Yeah. Anyway, so you know, like international socialism, its predictions did not come true. A further prediction which didn't come through, where revolution would take place. According to Marx's theory, opposite social revolution can only take place per their materialistic economic understanding of history in industrially developed economies. Right? Otherwise, it's not a socialist revolution. Well, this didn't happen anywhere. What happened, in fact, is that an ideologically motivated elite um, took charge and they forced revolution after, of course, the February Revolution. They took they forced revolution later in 1917, and you get obviously the Russian Civil War, and then yeah, you get the Soviet Union. And there was a certain proletariat element to it, but largely these were intellectuals, sons and daughters of the middle or petite class, or even above that, um, who were very ideologically motivated, and it was a vanguardist minority. Now that could be all well and good, that might actually work, but it causes problems with respect to Marxist theory. How is Marxism tenable as a theory of history if the only place where its revolutions are happening are places where they're not supposed to happen? Does that not call into question the power of economics as a vehicle in history? Does that not call into question the role of ideas, which is displaced in Marxist discourse in favor of, say, economic motives? But it seems the role of ideology and ideological vanguardism is quite cardinal here. And so this causes problems. This causes problems for a lot of reasons. One is that the rejection of utopian socialism rests upon the recognition that socialism is not just like uh, a claim, an ethical claim, right? But if you jettisoned normativity, right, and I'm sure Marxists back then were smart enough to realize that you cannot simultaneously hold to a mechanistic universe, while simultaneously affirming, these abstract universalist claims as absolutely true. It's just not tenable at all. Um, like, where did these ethical claims come from within such a universe? Can you answer me that? No, you can't. So there's huge problems there. I'm kind of rambling a little bit. So um, yeah, so there's a problem in Marxist discourse, and it's that wherever these revolutions happen, they're very often just a mystification, a revolutionary rationale, right, for nationalism or for an elite ideological agenda. A novo elite, perhaps not a traditional one, but an elite nevertheless. An elite of the mind, an elite in terms of an ideologically motivated cadre who seizes power, based upon its own sort of will. Or it's a cargo cult regime. A particularly illuminating quote with respect to all this is to be found in is to be found on the Wikipedia page. On the Wikipedia page of Pol Pot. Pol Pot talks about the Vietnamese War against the Cambodian state, and he said, at the time, previously we were Marxists because Marxism was in favor. Marxism as an ideology, it coincided with the interests of the Cambodian people. But now, as nationalists, a Marxist state is waging war on us. So now we appeal to the Americans, and now we're capitalists. And people could dismiss that. People could say that's Pol Pot, but I think that's really revealing of the nature of socialist regimes in the 20th century, which is that they're pretty much just cargo cult regimes. These are revolutionary developmentalist regimes at best, and at worst, they're just a total farce, which seek to industrialize their nation and modernize their nation, and which really have as the focal point, in terms of the real motivations of the actors behind it, of the masses which get on board with it, and of course, even if legitimacy does not rest upon the people, mandate is necessary as a prerequisite, especially in a mass society, for a functioning government. And that mandate in the Soviet Union did not come from being the standard bearer of world revolution. It came from the Great War. It came from defending the motherland. Um, and so, yeah, these things were these Marxist regimes were just cargo cults, and they make zero sense within Marxist theory. And so it's worse than the typical conservative narrative would tell you, right? It's not that Marxism is this incredibly pervasive ideology which killed 100 million people. No, it's worse than that. It's an ideology which is so ineffective that that its only purpose is in mystifying and veiling and concealing what is in reality third world cargo cults, reactive developmentalist nationalist regimes, and worse yet, the same imperative underlying these regimes, whether it's China, and you see this or the Soviet Union. You see this with the embrace of say Hamiltonian economics by Lenin, or you see this with the role of protectionism in China. Is that these are essentially, although there's a different ideological culture infused into these societies, they have the same imperatives as fascist Italy. What was the purpose of fascist Italy? Enrico Cardini talks about this in the year 1911 or 1910 with the Italian Nationalist Association. Cardini later joins the Fascist Party, and one of his devotees, Alfredo Rocco, becomes a pretty important fascist theoretician. The point of Italian fascism is to make Italy, to use the terms of Desmond Fennell, a normal nation. The point of fascist Italy is a recognition that as there are proletariat classes, there are also proletarian nations, and that Italy and the conditions that it's found itself in the early 20th century was a proletariat nation. It was a proletariat nation on account of its population's migration patterns, which were outward. It was a population which overwhelmingly emigrated. People did not immigrate to Italy as much, or the proportion that did was minuscule compared to the amount of Italians who left places, especially like in the New World, like America. The New World, like New York City and other metropoles, places in New Jersey and so on and so on and so on, as cheap labor. Italy had a nascent, if barely existent, industrial base. Again, not a place for socialist revolution to take place, etc., etc., etc. And so the fascist perspective, and this is where a lot of the history of anti-fascism is a history of cope. This is where imperatives are have been concealed, and as a result, it is not a phenomenon which is cognizable properly. But when one removes the obfuscation, when one removes the absurd anti-fascistic narratives, and if you want to understand how absurd they are, one must merely just perform a cursory reading of A. James Gregor's corpus, who exposes the ever shifting and often ever shifting narratives which sought to explain fascist Italy, and which also were very much linked to the directives and imperatives emanating from the Comintern and its hegemon, which was the Soviet Union. And so fascist Italy, like Libya under Gaddafi, like China, whatever, despite the differing ideological cultures which infused all of these regimes, its imperative was the same, and this is the revolutionary form of the 20th century. It's not class, it's not race, it is the developmentalist nation. It is the nation which seeks its place in the sun. It's the nation which seeks to be to stop being a raw exporter of materials, and instead an exporter of crafted industrial goods, which emanate from a strong a country with a strong secondary sector, a strong industrial sector. This is the revolutionary form, and this is some of the stuff that I've touched on in on the website, and other people have touched on the website, and it has relevance, of course, to Arthur Griffith and so on and so on and so on. So moving to the modern day, right? So we have a history of the 20th century in which Marxism is essentially irrelevant. We have a history of the 20th century in which the claims have not really come true. Capitalism in its organic gestation, absent the will to power of elite, ideologically motivated cadres, seems to subsist. It may make people miserable. The young Marx might be correct, and this is why the Frankfurt School defaulted to the young Marx, and why other theorists have as well. And perhaps capitalism has endemic issues not identified by Marx, which are worthy of criticism. But nevertheless, Marxism's central claims, and it does claim to be a science, right? So this stuff is must be verifiable, as Bernstein put it in his work Evolutionary Socialism. And I should probably add, and I haven't touched on this earlier, that Bernstein, the thrust of his point is that, as I just said there, if Marxism claims to be a science, it must be tested. Let's look at reality. Reality does not correspond to it. Therefore, ergo, socialism ought to shift in line with that. And socialism, rather than waiting for revolution to come about, rather than waiting for the working class to emerge, what socialism ought to do is ameliorate their condition by way of the state, democratize things to some extent, have a shorter working week, yada, yada, yada. But there's a number of issues with this. Firstly, this could exist with any regime. One could have an individualistic, a tribal, an ethnic, a cosmopolitan, etc. regime in which there is a strong welfare state, perhaps regulation, and etc., which benefits the workers. Secondly, from an orthodox Marxist perspective, this stymies revolution. One of the worst things for Marxists is not neoliberalism, austerity, even bloody stupid military juntas in the in the Central America, in Central America, backed by the CIA or whatever. No, the worst possible thing is what occurred in Marx's lifetime, which is I think was in Marx's lifetime, certainly in Engels' lifetime, which is the LaSalle-Bismarck alliance. This is where Ferdinand Lassalle, Marx's nephew and social democrat, allied with the nascent Prussian state, and they implemented at that time, pretty novel measures to ameliorate the conditions of the working class. Well, what does this do? It makes people content. It creates the conditions for what is known as a labor aristocracy. It reduces internationalism in that people become tethered to the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's insanely insidious from an orthodox Marxist perspective, or even from an ersatz perspective, as represented by one George Sorel. So this is a total net negative. So, from a Marxist perspective, so that's the issue, I suppose, with social democracy a la Bernstein. But Bernstein was insightful. He was making an incisive point. And in some ways, a recognition of both of these problems is where fascism partly comes from as a political culture. So I mentioned fascism as a imperative of a nation seeking its place in the sun, seeking its place in modernity. What about fascism as a political culture? Well, that stems. I think Ziv Sternhal is correct. That there was, prior to even in Germany, although one could look at certain currents there, or even in Italy, the current of the emphasis on duty in, say, the work of Manzini, contra the liberal emphasis on rights without duties. I think, but more clearly than both of those instances, in France, there was an intellectual culture which very much emanated and was in dialogue with Marxism, though not exclusively. You have people like Barré, who didn't really seem to be in dialogue with Marxism. Certainly, what's his name? He was involved in Action France. Charles Marat, he certainly was in dialogue with laborism and therefore Marxism. But you also have characters. Their names are not coming to mind, but they're covered in the work of Ziv Sternhal, who took an ethical approach to socialism and thereby deviated away from orthodox Marxism. And certainly this emanates from socialism, which isn't to say that the horseshoe theory is true per se, but it's simply to say that everyone in the 20th century on some level was in dialogue with Marx, or the early 20th century at the very least. So moving forward to the current day, another thing capitalism has managed to do to reduce the enmity between the workers and the proletariat is offshore industrialization. And also not only to that, but to nullify the Western proletariat, which is now largely transmuted into either the lumpen proletariat or, in more fortuitous cases, the sons of the proletariat have become middle class. And thus the proletariat in its traditional sense has been nullified. Labor unions are outmoded. Those who would proffer an abstract notion per Marx of the working class. According to Marx, what the working class sells is his labor power. You know, that might be well and that might be true. Um, but these things, these abstractions. If one is to take dialectical materialism, historical materialism seriously, these abstract pithy statements, do they really matter all that much? Um, why did Marx? We have to ask this looking back. Why did Marx recognize as significant, this concentrated entity within Western metropoles, which had a lot of experience running factories, which was capable of, because it was the prerequisite for these factories to work, was capable of running the machine which kept vast empires, unprecedented in power and wealth and influence and so on, running. What made this different from, say, the oppressed farmers of yore or the oppressed peasants or lumpen proletariat people, in the cities? Well, it was that they were capable of shutting down national production. It's that they had a stranglehold on the society. It's that the parasites, the people who appropriated the surplus, of their work, they were really by the balls, by the cojones by this group, Um, and I think there was a certain merit to that. I'm not a Marxist. I think Marx is very insightful, and I think he was right to single this group out. And no other group could have done it. You know, the farmers couldn't have done it. The lumpen proletariat couldn't have done it. So on and so on and so on. And this is the true significance of the nullification of the decline of the Western proletariat. That the Marxist tradition has lost its revolutionary subject. And so, when people like Laszlo argue in favor of socialism, argue in favor of the working man, well, who is the working man? Is the working man someone who makes coffee? Not to depreciate or insult people who make coffee. Is the working man somebody who works in PwC, as an accountant? Not to depreciate people who work there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but simply to recognize that the economy can work independent of these people. One of the facts of globalism is the fungibility of labor, you know, um, and unless one wants to engage in a politics of national laborism, in which labor aristocracy is buttressed, which could be all well and good. I'm not against that necessarily, and one could remove um, the mechanisms which allow for the replacement of such work by cheap labor. So mass immigration could be quashed. The international treaties which permit the settlement en masse of refugees could be quashed, and so on and so on and so on. That could all happen, but this isn't Marxism. Marxism is not a labor aristocracy, and Marxists like Laszlo, I think, have to get real about the fact that it seems like you've lost your revolutionary subject. It seems like you've lost, this almost reaches the point of parody, this fetish for trade unionism now, which is not a tradition. The trade union tradition is not something which is without critique within the Marxist tradition. I'm sure Laszlo will be well aware. Um, what you have with Marxism, or sorry, with what you have with this trade union, I think they had it in California among writers, the Writers Guild trade union. Like, this work is so easily replaceable, whether it's by an automated chatbot, whether it's by a young hungry writer who will work for far less and will savor the opportunities available to them. This is not a 19th century proletariat, and I think there was a chance for Marxism, had an organic consciousness developed among these workers, for the world to have been changed on some fundamental level. Now, I agree with some of Bakunin's critiques of Marx with respect to the state and so on and so on and so on. So I won't go too far, but it seems like they've lost their opportunity. And because of the Hegelian inheritance, because it seems like there's this teleology, that inevitably we're going to win. This is the sense you get among them. It seems to me it seems to be more of an article of faith, and it seems that it's obscured them to the fact that the working class is dead, which is something which the Frankfurt School recognized on some level, although there was an extant working class at the time of their writing, even if it was about to be eclipsed. And it's something which people like Gramsci sort of appreciated as well. So those are just some of my rambling thoughts on Marxism. I want to thank you for listening. I want to podcast a bit more often. And yeah, I'll see you another time.